A very good morning to all of you. These days, it's quite common to hear usages like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary as prefixes to what one is doing. It's common to hear that, you know, my institution is a transdisciplinary research center, or we hear I'm doing interdisciplinary research, or I'm part of a multidisciplinary team, etc., doing some piece of research on environment or sustainability. But also they are sometimes used interchangeably. And we all agree that sustainability issues, among the many and concurrent crises ongoing in the world, we need all disciplinary strength. And so researchers need clarity on what kind of approach will be of use in different contexts and different scales. So that's why INSEE thought of kickstarting a dialogue towards that goal in collaboration with the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. We have two eminent thinkers in this domain from two different parts of the world conversing among themselves and with us today. So the format of this online dialogue will be like this. In the first 10, it's in two parts actually. This dialogue online event is planned in two parts. In the first part, the presenters or the speakers will share their ideas and then also converse them among themselves. And in the second part, they will respond to the questions from the audience. And, first, Gabriele will talk for about 10 minutes, and then Sharath will share his ideas for about 10 minutes, and then they can kind of have a Q&A among themselves, or if there aren't many, we will then take up the questions from the audience, which are put in the chat box, and from there, Webex will be sequencing it in the order of appearing in the chat box. With that, I invite Professor Gabriele Bammer to present her ideas on transdisciplinarity and sustainability.
Well, great. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. I'm going to start by just outlining briefly where I'm coming from so that we can start this dialogue with an understanding of what it is that I do and what I care about. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Sharath has to say and then to having some back and forth. I'm hoping you can see my slides and that you can hear me okay, and I'm assuming you'll tell me if you can't. So it's not happening. Yeah. Oh, there we go. All right. So I'm going to argue that research that helps to move us towards sustainable social development is a combination of both monodisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. And that this is true for research on any complex problem. And so what do I mean by this? To do that, I wanted to start, I just picked an example of something that we might not have thought about, but that is probably important for a sustainable society, which is what do we do with illicit drug users? And let's imagine that we're in a city called City X, which could be anywhere. Think about it in your context. Okay. So then some of the questions that we would ask would be questions that disciplines are well placed to answer. An example of that kind of a question is how many illicit drug users are there in City X? And if you wanted to answer that question, you'd ask a demographer, because demographers have skills in estimating hidden populations. So illicit drug users generally don't advertise that that's what they're doing. But demographers have a range of techniques for getting at that. So there are, within a complex question like incorporating illicit drug use into sustainable society in City X, there'll be some questions that are perfect for disciplines to answer. There'll be some questions that need interdisciplinary skills. So let's think about a question about how does the illicit drug market work in City X? And if you were going to address a question like that, you would bring together economists because they know a lot about markets, sociologists and anthropologists because they know quite a lot about behaviours of users and dealers. And what they would do is that they would work together in an academic context to improve our understanding of this particular question. And they do that by agreeing at the beginning how they were going to develop the problem. And then they would bring together a range of perspectives. They might interview illicit drug users and drug dealers, but they wouldn't include them as co-investigators in the study. So interdisciplinary stays within the academy but works across disciplines, and the disciplines together frame the problem. So then let's think about a transdisciplinary question. If we were going to ask something like, how can we make illicit drug use safer in City X, then that's a transdisciplinary problem. And you'd bring together a whole range of different people. So, for example, you'd probably bring together epidemiologists who know something about health problems and their frequency, criminologists who know something about adverse social effects, crime and their frequency, illicit drug users to share their lived experience and their ideas for change, and then a bunch of other people like emergency room staff and police and government policy makers. These are just examples. And what they do is focus not only on understanding the problem better, but also how you would bring about change. That's what transdisciplinarity does. Again, they define the problem together up front and they combine their disciplinary expertise, they combine practical experience and ideas from those affected by the problem, drug users, police, service providers, and they combine practical experience and ideas from those in a position to improve the problem, government policymakers. So they would all work together to improve our knowledge base and to come up with ideas for making illicit drug use safer in City X. That's transdisciplinary research. And I've left multidisciplinary to last, even though they're usually talked about in a different sequence, because for me, this is, it's a different style of research and the most interesting from my perspective. So if we were going to ask a question like, what would life look like for an illicit drug user in a sustainable society in City X? What you'd do is you'd invite a whole bunch of people to answer that question quite independently. So you might ask lawyers and anthropologists and criminologists and sociologists to all write about their perspective on what life should look like. You'd also ask drug users, maybe parents of drug users, maybe ex-users, maybe service providers, and you'd choose one. You'd either get them to work together as a group or you choose one person to think about how to do this. And again, you'd think about people who could do something about the problem, so government policymakers and non-governmental organisational leaders. So you'd get all of them to think about how they would address this question from their discipline or personal perspective. In this case, rather than trying to define the issue or come up with a common problem framing at the beginning, every contributor would define it according to their own expertise and perspectives, and then not integrated during the investigation. So what they're doing is bringing their expertise to bear. The integration happens at the end. So you can bring the contributors together when they've all made their contributions to look for similarities and differences between those contributions, or the person who's using those contributions. So it might be somebody who is bringing about change, or it might be, somebody who's in a position to try to move this forward. They could also look at all these different perspectives and do their own kind of integration. So if we come back to the original proposition, which is that research requires a combination of these four things, what I've tried to show is that different approaches are useful for different aspects of the problem under consideration. Complex problems have many aspects, and some aspects lend themselves to mono, some to multi, some to inter, and some to trans. Now, before I go any further, I should make a disclaimer. As Seema said right at the beginning, these terms are used very interchangeably. They also, each of them have quite different meanings. I've given you one meaning for these that is commonly accepted for people working on complex problems. There are other meanings too, and if you're interested, we can spend some time in questions on that. But for the purposes of this discussion, where we're talking about sustainable societies, and complex problems, I want to give a common definition of each of these ways of proceeding. As I've indicated, inter and transdisciplinarity, the integration happens at the framing stage. So at the beginning, you agree on what you're going to do and how you're going to bring those perspectives together. For multidisciplinarity, the integration happens at the end. You let everybody define the problem as they see fit. And transdisciplinarity and often multidisciplinarity incorporate expertise from outside the academy. So they don't just work within the academy, but they recognise that there's expertise outside the academy and bring that to bear as well. So I want to just touch briefly on the kind of expertise that somebody needs if they want to tackle these kind of big problems. This is the work that I do. This is the kind of thing that gets me out of bed in the morning and excited about the day. So I've argued that in developing integration and implementation sciences that there are three things that we're trying to do. The first is that we're trying to understand the problem and the potential actions more comprehensively. The second is that we're trying to support policy and practice improvement by government, business and civil society. And the third is that we're trying to help people interact effectively. So to do that, for the first of these, you need to understand that that problems are systems problems, that everything's connected to everything else basically, and those connections can be quite complex. And that change is also about systems change. It's not necessarily about changing people one person at a time. That context is important, that the political, historical, social, economic, cultural context all matter, and that will affect both how you understand the problem and what you can do about it. That we have to worry about what we don't know, not only what we know we don't know, but also what we don't know we don't know. That's where the nasty surprises come from. So we need to have a pretty comprehensive understanding of what we don't know. We have to embrace diversity. So we want to bring together a whole range of different perspectives if we want to understand things more comprehensively. You can't stay in one box. You need to really think about, so who has a perspective on this that could be useful? And then integration. You can't just develop a whole range of perspectives. You also need to figure out how you're going to bring at least some of those perspectives together. In terms of supporting policy and practice improvement, the sort of expertise that you need is you need to understand how decisions get made. You need to understand how research gets implemented in those decisions. And you need to understand how change happens. That change is quite a complex process, that there's change happening all the time, that the world's not waiting for your research results, that there's change happening all the time and you've got to get in there and try to influence how that change happens. And then the third thing you need to have expertise in is helping people interact effectively. So you need to be good at communicating, you need to be good at helping teams of people work together, and you need to be good at helping teams of academics engage with stakeholders, the people who have the problem and the people who can do something about it. When we're doing this, it's important to also realise that imperfection is inevitable. You can't ever have full understanding and you can't ever do something that's perfect because systems have no natural boundaries. You're always working in an artificial system because change is constant. Sorry, that should be is, not if. Because you can never fully understand context, because unknowns are inevitable. You can never solve all the unknowns. Unknowns are an infinite ocean, and knowledge is a small island in that ocean. And diversity is a given. So something that some group of people think is a great solution, another group of people will think is a terrible solution. So you can never have perfect understanding or perfect answers. What I've basically presented is the framework for integration and implementation sciences. There's a graphic here that shows it. I don't expect you to be able to read it because the printings are pretty small, but there is a reference and the slides are available if anybody's interested. So if you want to know more about how integration and implementation sciences works, there's this easy to read, hopefully, blog post that explains it. I want to talk about how we build the tools. I've been developing a blog and repository. This is, the URL is here, and this is a place where people from around the world are invited to share their tools, their concepts, methods, frameworks for dealing with complexity. We've had a great couple of great blog posts from SEMA, so look those up, but think about contributing yourself. It's a way of starting to make that expertise known and coherent. There are new tools and oldies. They aim to be short and easy to read, and we're aiming to be a global group. The advantage of starting a discipline now is that we have an opportunity to move forward together across the globe, that it doesn't have to be the ideas are developed in the north and exported to the south. We have expertise and different contexts in different places. So it's really important that we share those and move forward together. As you were told in the introduction, I'm the president of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. So let me just make you aware of their website, and I'll stop there. I think that gives you an idea of where I'm coming from, and I'm greatly looking forward to hearing what Sharad has to say and then to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for that very systematic mapping of different approaches to one complex issue, and where one actually start doing integration. That's a very good curtain raiser for today's dialogue. Thanks a lot. Let me invite Sarah, our Dr. Sharachchandra Lele, for the next ideation.
Thank you, Seema, and thank you, Gabriele. I think you have covered a lot of ground. In fact, I think you have covered all the basics. Makes my task a whole lot easier. So I had actually started with this slide of what do we mean by interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and also what do we mean by sustainability, since this dialogue is about transdisciplinarity for sustainability in some sense. And I would just like to elaborate a little bit on what Gabriele said, keeping in mind where I'm coming from, which is that I've been working in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary manner on environmental issues. So this, my perspective is formed very much in the context of environmental problems, not inter or transdisciplinarity more generally. For example, the case that Gabriele used was in a space of drug use, about which I cannot really claim to have any understanding. So my perspective is formed in the context of environmental problems. And for me, interdisciplinarity, which is what I began with, say, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, was about the bridging of the natural and the social science divides. But soon I also added the humanities to this for the reason that I will explain in a bit. So interdisciplinarity was the integration of these disciplinary blocks in some sense, whereas transdisciplinarity, which, as Gabriele said, is a more recent term in some ways, is about bridging the science-society divide or the knowledge-action divide. And very often in current dialogues, it means co-production, the integration of knowledge from the formal academic sector and the informal knowledge that everybody else who is in that sector, either facing problems or trying to solve problems, would bring. So co-production is a very central idea in the idea of transdisciplinarity. But I would like to extend the idea of transdisciplinary work by saying that it is about bridging knowledge and action. So it is knowledge for action, and it is not just knowledge that is ready for action, but knowledge that actually leads to action. And I think in that sense, transdisciplinarity pushes the envelope beyond just saying that we need to co-produce knowledge. We need to actually bring about change in some fashion, or contribute to bringing about change. And the third point I'd like to clarify upfront is, although we have used the term sustainability in the title of this dialogue, I think for INSEE this is a catch-all term or a shorthand for a good society. But it is, I think, better to be explicit about what we mean by a good society. And I don't think that the term sustainability, for all its elasticity in current dialogues, really captures our idea of good society. And so I've used this fivefold graphic many times before, that our definition of a good society or the goals of a good society should include first and foremost human well-being in both its material and non-material senses, the well-being of non-humans, which is sort of coming from the conservation perspective, questions of equity and justice, including environmental justice, and questions of sustainability and resilience, and finally the idea of democratic governance. And I think unless we define our good society in this broad sense, the term sustainability could very often mean continuing what is happening today and not falling off a cliff. But what we may not be particularly happy with what is happening today. And not all environmental problems are problems of intergenerational injustice. They are often problems of intragenerational injustice. And in that sense, I think it's really important for us to have a multidimensional idea of what we are talking about here. Coming to the next point, which is, okay, if we have an understanding of what we mean by inter or transdisciplinary knowledge production, and what is our understanding of what that production is for, which is a good society, why do we really need inter and transdisciplinary kind of work, which, as Gabriele said, this is not to put down in any sense monodisciplinary or multidisciplinary work, but point out that there is a space for all of these varieties of knowledge production, and to acknowledge that by and large, historically, production has been more and more monodisciplinary. And if at all there has been any attempt to move away from that, it has tended to be multi rather than inter or transdisciplinary. So the importance of inter or trans is in the context where it has been still pretty much on the fringes of academia. So again, repeating this point that inter or transdisciplinary research is not a good in itself. It is only required really if one wants knowledge for change. And it is required both in the analysis of problems. We must have a way, the knowledge that we produce must speak to societal concerns. So the idea of speaking to these multiple notions of a good society, as I flagged earlier, and it must be holistic. It must clarify the entire problem, not just one particular piece of the puzzle. And in the context of environmental problem, this means we require the disciplines of the humanities, particularly philosophy, and then also an understanding of the natural sciences and the social sciences to understand what is the nature of the environmental problem in a philosophical sense. Is it a problem of, for example, sustainability or equity, as we often discuss in the context of climate change? What are the biophysical processes that cause the problem, and what are the social processes that might explain why we are in that particular situation, and of course then how we might move forward to get out of it. And this moving forward to get out of it is the knowledge for change component, the transdisciplinary component. And this then definitely requires, as Gabriele pointed out, stakeholder engagement. It also, I think, requires a theory of change. How will the knowledge that I produce or my group produces or my team produces actually lead to change on the ground? And I think that's something that we need to spend some time discussing as we go forward in this dialogue. I will just quickly talk about the how part of it based on my own experience. For the idea of holistic analysis, we have to really frame problems very self-consciously because as academics, although we are under the illusion that we are, these neutral knowledge producers, we very much, our knowledge is very much value laden, especially in the context of applied issues and environmental problems in particular. So self-consciously framing problems through multiple value lenses, and in identifying these lenses, we would have to do some amount of co-production with those who are in the problem in a sense, working backwards from problems to their interconnected drivers. And this will require us to learn whatever is necessary, because very often our disciplinary training is not good enough or adequate for that building that holistic understanding. So in a sense, going beyond our own discipline, learning other disciplines, learning from them, but also interrogating other disciplines, because very often they themselves come with a certain bias, a certain value and epistemological framework. So interrogation is as important as learning. And which means then creating space for multiple explanations. I think this is really important in the context of the social science side of the story, because we see very often that the bigger divide, according to me, is not just between the natural and the social sciences, but in fact within the social sciences, where different disciplines refuse to talk to each other. So I kind of try to get past that problem by saying, if this is our goal of a good society, and we know that we are not anywhere close to this goal, what could explain that the reason why we are far away from this goal could be distorted markets, it could be governance failures, it could be the political economy of resource access or environmental pollution, it could be the problem of social discrimination in its multiple dimensions. It could be the kind of values themselves that people hold. Maybe people don't even believe in ideas of justice and sustainability. It could be the science that we practice itself, and certainly the technology that is out there could be reductionist or inappropriate to promoting a good society. And these different explanations of why we are in this situation actually interact. That is, one might reinforce the other. For example, political economy explanations might also tell us a little bit about why people hold certain values and how their values are currently being shaped in the context of a certain political economy operating out there. So I think creating a space where we are comfortable with these multiple explanations and are able to then sift through them in a particular context is really, really important. And the second part of doing this, which is the transdisciplinary part of it, if we want problem-solving research, that is research that leads to action and change towards a good society, we will, as Gabriele said, have to identify and engage with multiple stakeholders and actors. We will have to build alliances, especially with the weaker ones, and be willing to confront the more powerful ones, including the state. And I want to really point this out, this last bit, carefully, which is that very often as academics, we are maybe unconsciously holding the belief that as long as we bring the best possible knowledge to the problem, or maybe if we co-produce that knowledge with some of the stakeholders, it will actually lead to change. But what we find in reality is that many of the stakeholders are not interested in change because they have certain interests that would be hurt if the change actually happened. So, and that includes, unfortunately, very often the states within which we function, which might even be supporting the academic work that we are doing. And I think this is a really, what shall I say, obvious context in the developing world. We are in a post-colonial state in most cases. The colonial hangover has not gone away. We are not deeply democratic states, and there have been swings across the world, and we don't have to talk about the developing world anymore. We can see that swing across Europe and the North Americas, where the swing has been towards exactly the opposite of what we said was our definition of a good society, towards a society that does not believe in environmental conservation or does not believe even in democracy. So I think we will be very naive if we were to assume that more knowledge, even co-produced knowledge, will actually lead to change, because the question of power, the question of powerful interest groups that are opposed to change, including the state, is very much out there. And we need to be then, in a sense, be willing to confront, willing to build alliances. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharad. Opening a new window to the topic of transdisciplinarity, and also clarifying for all of us what you mean and we would like to see sustainability as, and how action is so important in transdisciplinarity, especially looking at from a global south perspective, I would say. Thanks a lot. So I would now request both of you, if you have some comments and observations or questions, you can talk to each other, Gabriele and Sharad. Can I request Gabriele?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you. That was terrific. I was really, I was excited to see the overlap between what we do and the richness that you added from the perspective that you bring. ATREE does fabulous work. And that was very clear from what you did. And I have to, so I'm also going to make a confession. So when you said that sustainability is a good society, and because we don't necessarily want to perpetuate what we have now, I had an aha moment and I thought, that's not how I've been thinking about it. And that's because I come from the global north and I'm pretty comfortable, right? So perpetuating what we have isn't an issue for me. And that completely demonstrates why we need to work together, right? That was just such a powerful aha moment for me. And it was interesting that in my talk, I also talked a lot more about working with government. You talked a lot more about challenging government and encouraging government to reform. Absolutely right. And, again, I think that's very much a product of our different contexts. And I think that, so for me, that just highlights the necessity of working across cultures and different ways of seeing the world, because if you just work within your own, you just have these blinkers that you don't really see. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Gabriele. I just wanted to ask a question. You gave the example of drug use. I assume that that's an example that you're somewhat more familiar with, that you might have actually worked in that kind of a space. And so sort of reflecting on what I said about the more complex nature of social change and the fact that there are interests that are not necessarily willing to co-produce knowledge for change along with you. Has that been your own experience, even if the state is perhaps not that big a culprit in certain contexts, but I'm sure there are other powerful actors that are opposed to change? Would you say that that holds true across the board, or what has been your experience on that front?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? So yes, I do have more experience with drug use than I have with environmental problems. So I tried to shape a sustainability question around drug use so that I felt more comfortable. And I thought it would also be a bit more of a challenging question to think about in terms of a good society, a good society or a sustainable society. I guess I think about what you've talked about a little bit differently. But partly because I'm more into theory and methods development, and I think you're more into practice and actually doing practical things on the ground. I think it's important. So co-production is the goal, but the reality is that it doesn't always happen. And one of the things that happens is that when people publish papers, they call what happened co-production. And when you read what they did, it absolutely is not co-production, right? So I guess I'm also calling for honesty and tolerance about, so I think this is partly what you're saying, recognition that it's not always possible, and then being honest about what was possible and what you did, rather than pretending that, you did this wonderful co-produced study when in fact, you could hardly contact people at all.
The other thought that occurs to me is that, having been in academia or maybe in a boundary organization like ATREE, I find academia often and increasingly actually more stifling, in the sense that the markers of success, the ideas of what shall I say, on the basis of which people are evaluated, on the basis of which disciplines define themselves as successful, still remain very fragmented and very inward looking, so that in fact if one were to produce knowledge which is transdisciplinary in collaboration with other actors in that space, and if that knowledge was actually to lead to some change, some positive change, it's not clear that would necessarily be the most highly regarded piece of work by academic standards, because of the way academia continues to set its standards. And I find that even the idea of even interdisciplinarity, it is still very much lip service, because disciplines appropriate problems into themselves. So you might have, to give my own experience, the field of environment. If you look at the 60s and the 70s, when the field emerged in a big way, you have the emergence of interdisciplinary environmental journals like Ambio and so on, which really thought that we need all the disciplines to be contributing to understanding the problem. But over time, you will see that environment has now become a field that is appropriated into different disciplines. So you have environmental economics, you have environmental philosophy, you have environmental political science, you have environmental sociology, you've got, so each, traditional, and this is particularly true of the social sciences, each traditional social science discipline has tended to appropriate the environmental problem rather than wanting to step out of its comfort zone and engage in an interdisciplinary space. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily agree with you that that's a problem. I think for disciplines to broaden their perspective is also a good thing. And I guess the change that I've seen over time is that inter and transdisciplinary work are becoming more highly respected. And I think that's on us, not on the system, right? So I guess what I think, so speaking now with my president of the Global Alliance hat on, and I'm glad, Sharad, that we both talk with our hands. I think that's that's really good. We're both kind of waving our hands about. So it's our job as academics to band together. Physicists don't, and astronomers don't get huge millions of dollars for their research by sitting back and letting the government give it to them, right? They band together, they lobby, and they make things happen in their own interests. And we've got to play that game too. So I think if we think this is important in an academic space, then we have to band together. And one of our big problems is fragmentation, that the people doing this work, so I wouldn't have known about your work if Seema hadn't introduced us. So, you know, we need to band together. We need to band together not just within the academy, but with associations like ATREE. And we need to kind of bang on the doors of the funders and the research policymakers and say, we're here. And you got to take us seriously, guys. What do you think? What do you think the role is of an organisation like ATREE in this kind of a activity?
Well, I'll come back to, I'll talk about that in a minute, but I wanted to say that, one of the reasons that probably astronomers get a lot of money is because what they do is not threatening the powers that be at some level. But to the extent, in fact, that it has begun to threaten, because it still is a science. Astronomy or physics or chemistry are sciences, and even thinking scientifically now is threatening the powers that be. So I think you will find, and the evidence is out there that even support for these basic and relatively, shall we say, apolitical sciences is shrinking across the board. And that's true even in India, it's true elsewhere in the world, because thinking scientifically itself is now a threat to those in power. So having said that, I think therefore the role that organizations like ATREE play is really critical, because we sit at the knowledge action divide as much as we sit at the interdisciplinary divide in some sense, because to go back to my what I said earlier, I think we are sort of imbued with the idea that we are here to produce knowledge for change, and then do whatever it requires. And sometimes even disciplinary knowledge might be enough. As my colleague Jagdish used to point out, that just measuring the amount of sediment in a river, downstream of a mine, might be an important piece of evidence in bringing about the legal action on that mine. And you don't necessarily need an interdisciplinary piece of work in every context. But so looking at the problem and then working backward as to what kind of knowledge we require, and what are the values embedded in even framing that problem. Whose values are we talking about, and how can we then work with these multiple stakeholders with their multiple value lenses, keeping in mind the disparities in society, that not all stakeholders hold the same amount of power and so on, has been, I think, the kind of evolution of ATREE's thinking.
So, I mean, what you said was that the opening remark about, astronomers being not challenging the power structures in society, I think is critically important. And how does ATREE navigate that space? I think that's our weak point from a from the perspective of what's happening politically in the world. And so how do we survive while maintaining that challenge?
That's a really good question. And I think perhaps the ATREE governing board members might have different views on this than I do, but I think we are doing a good job of maintaining scientific credibility while speaking to some of these urgent problems. It still limits. I mean, the political system today in India seriously limits the kind of work we can do because there's, for instance, very little government funding for work on the environment. And so you have to look elsewhere. There's no point in really knocking on those doors, let alone receptivity to, whatever you find, even without their funding. So I think one has to navigate this space very carefully, especially because both universities as well as non-university research organizations are, constantly monitored for to see whether they are stepping out of line. So it's a challenge, and I think Seema will agree with me. She's just she's been with Azim Premji University for several decades, and I'm sure they face similar problems there or challenges. And I think that's true for all of us. One way I think we can navigate this is by knocking on multiple doors and not expecting government to be our own sole funder. There are people, philanthropists out there that are willing to support this kind of work, that believe in knowledge for change. And I think the other thing is by reducing our own expectations. So maybe we don't expect to be those fancy academics that we thought we would be with good salaries and so on. And, maybe reduce our expectations so that we can actually work with the least powerful.
Interesting. I guess I think a good example too is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mean, the people who, so there's a tension for researchers, right? If you see an injustice, what do you do about it? Or if you see a problem, and I think climate change is a great example of that, where scientists were seeing the problem and wanting to alert society to it. And it's kind of really interesting to watch that. The playing out of how they've gained power and tried to get the voice across, and the pushback that's come. And we're still in the middle of it, right? We may or may not survive. So I guess they've tried to be quite politically savvy in what they've done. What's the biggest success story for ATREE?
Well, I don't know about that, but I was just going to say that the alternative, or I wouldn't say an alternative, but another way of doing this is actually working bottom up. So one of the things that ATREE has done, and I think has done well, is building alliances with communities, indigenous people, other kinds of groups that are really on the margins, and asking the question, what are the challenges they face, and where can our knowledge really contribute to alleviating, or overcoming those particular obstacles that they face. And sometimes it can be as simple as, being invited to a place where people have people are facing the non-implementation of a particular act. In my work, it's been the Forest Rights Act. And they are struggling to get it implemented for their, to get their rights, investigating why that is the case, what are the bottlenecks, what are the misunderstandings or misinterpretations of the law, or just lack of geospatial information, and how can then one bring that to the forefront, to the attention of the decision makers, and thereby enable these communities to get rights. And that has worked, I think, in some cases, but in other cases not. So because the decision makers might still be refusing to change their decisions. So it's a challenge, but I think working bottom up is, for me personally, crucial, because yes, I think IPCC was absolutely essential, A, for a problem like climate change, which is a global common pool problem, and B, in a context where the problem was not even being recognized as a problem. Now, 30 or 40 years later, now it is a case of people who are not asleep and therefore need to be awakened to the problem, but people who are feigning being asleep, pretending to be asleep, then you cannot really awaken them. So I think we're in a different world now.
Whose interests and values are being really strongly challenged. Seema, are you happy for us to continue on a little more, or do you want to intervene?
Yeah, I would like to just add another layer to it, which is kind of implicit, but not really, it was not coming up. Like we talked about, I mean, you both in the conversation, it emerged that it may be politically incorrect to work towards a good society or a sustainable society, the way we kind of discussed it today. And also, it may not be economically relevant, or it may not be growth friendly, and hence it may not have acceptance. But to me, another larger issue is also the impossibility of any change at, beyond a scale. Like we have been hearing about treaties and reports and estimates of damages and environmental and social upheavals from 1972 onwards, at least. So after all these decades, apart from making these jargons of commonplace, I don't think much change has happened on the ground. And in that sense, like if you actually think about the impossibility of bringing change at a larger scale in between international agreements and estimates, maybe what Sharad talked about, like bottom up, that could be the only space where we can think about sustainability. What do you think, Gabriele?
Well, I guess I wanted to take the conversation in this direction, but maybe not exactly in the same way that you have, Seema. So
Okay.
bottom up is kind of a really interesting concept, right? So in the work that I've done a small amount of empirical work, and I certainly have worked with illicit drug users and their families, and that's kind of bottom up work. But if I think about inequality in Australia, the biggest inequality is with our Indigenous population, right? And then the idea of white fella researchers marching in and saying, "Hey fellas, we want to help you solve your problems." We did that for a long time, right? And Indigenous populations have come back and said, "We're sick of this. We're sick of you telling us what the problem is, etc., etc." And it's led to something that I think is really wonderful in Australia, which is that it's Indigenous control of research. And so as a white fellow researcher, you can no longer go into an Indigenous community and say, "Here I am. I've got, I'm interested in this problem. I can see this is a major problem for you. Let me help you fix it." It's a completely different approach now. What you were talking about, Sharad, co-production is much more demanded. And if they don't want you there, they can tell you when there's nothing, and you need to go away. So I'm curious how that, we have a very strong ethic in Australia of how to do Indigenous research, which is led by Indigenous communities in Australia. And I think that's been a fantastic development. It's happened over the course of my career, and I've sort of been able to see it happen. A lot of non-Indigenous researchers were very badly bruised in that process. They were very well-meaning. They actually did some good work a lot of the time, but they were kind of as part of what had to happen was that they were disempowered and disrespected, which is a bit problematic. But I think overall the change has been a fantastically good one. And I'm curious how that plays out in your context.
Okay. Would Sharad like to go?
Maybe very briefly, I think we should probably bring in questions from the audience also. But I agree with you, Gabriele, that that's the direction in which we also need to go. In a sense, I'm the white person within the Indian context because of the similar very high levels of stratification in our own society, but we are far away from acknowledging these divides and perhaps changing the way we do our work. The academic space is again highly sort of splintered over these questions of social stratification and what to do about that, and how do we bring in voices from these marginalized groups into academia in a respectful manner, and not just in a sort of a more hierarchical manner. So I think we have a long way to go in that direction. And I also wanted to clarify that bottom up doesn't necessarily, it's not in exclusion of top down. It's because we know that there are many structural problems in society.
Yes.
And so it's not just about working at the micro level, but actually building alliances across multiple locations, sectors, scales, because we need to change, we need to bring about structural change. But to bring that change about, we will need to, build those coalitions, which are, putting those building blocks together. So it's building experience from the bottom up to push for structural change.
So at that note, thanking everyone and having a wonderful time this morning, a holiday in India for all. I will leave it to Shamashri for the last word.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you very much to Sharath and Gabriele for this. Often we say that it was a thought-provoking discussion, but today it was a thought-provoking discussion indeed. And that is reflected in the number of questions and the kind of questions that we received, which actually took the discussion forward. So I would like to thank both the speakers, and I would call you speakers as well as the discussants. So thank you very much for joining us. And we would also like to thank everybody from INSEE and ITD Alliance who actually worked to make this happen. A lot of networking and working back and forth, to and fro. So that was really important. So thank you, everyone.